Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Samiha Abdulwali. I'm one of the heads of Alfaisal MedHub, which is an initiative under the umbrella of the International Office College of Medicine. Alfaisal MedHub basically aims to create an online global community of medical students. Alfaisal MedHub covers a broad range of topics that are common to medical students all around the world, and one of our primary goals is to help medical students understand the career opportunities available to them once they graduate and the know how of the process that surrounds these opportunities. So, since one of the main concerns that medical students are always confused of is what's ahead of them, Al Faisal Medhub's Career Guidance series tackles this very issue through the lens of experienced and accomplished seniors. We are happy to share with you that these career guidance series are conducted in partnership with Amboss. And today I would like to reintroduce you to Dr. Omar Bakal, who is a graduate of Al Faisal University and is currently a PGY1 internal medicine resident at Mayo Clinic, Arizona. Today's workshop is drafting a CV for your ERAS residency application. And Dr. Umar, you can start whenever you want. Also, for the questions, you can put them in the chat, and Dr. Umar will address them at the end.
Thank you so much,
Yes, Dr.
Samiha. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here, and I hope you guys can make the most of this opportunity. And I want this to be interactive. We're gonna have a lot of questions, like always, towards the end. For those who are joining us back from the previous workshop we did just earlier today, welcome back. And for those who are here for the first time, welcome. So as I said, we're going to be having a lot of questions towards the end, and I'll be more than happy to go through those. I want it to be interactive in the sense that, there's an aspect of some technical things that I'll be touching upon with regards to the ERAS CV. If you guys are applying for the match this year, most of you guys will be aware already of those details. But in addition to that, I would just want to kind of tell you guys about a few tips and advice that you should be taking into consideration when working on your applications. So let's see. How is everyone doing today?
Really great, Doctor.
Awesome, good to hear that. Very nice. Okay, now that I know you guys are doing great, it is time we start our presentation. Let me just share my screen. Share my screen. Share screen. Is that visible to you guys?
Yes, Doctor, it's visible.
Yes, Doctor.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay. All right. So as Samiha mentioned, the topic of this workshop is going to be working and drafting on your ERAS application CV. Just as I did in the previous webinar, I at some point realized that how important it is to reach out to IMGs and just kind of be at their service when it comes to advice and guidance and stuff. And there were a lot of questions that I would get asked from different people, and these were the same questions, and I felt like there needed to be like a more uniform, unified source of information coming from my end. And that's the reason I started this channel on YouTube with my name, and I have already uploaded a series of videos on the match. They're free to watch. Go ahead, and if you guys would like to check out those videos and see if they can be of benefit to you guys. And then obviously I got an Instagram as well. But given my residency commitments and other personal commitments, obviously I'm not a celebrity, not an influencer, but just it's just it's meant to be a means of sharing my personal experience, day-to-day experience in residency with you guys. So obviously the time I'm able to commit to it is limited, but hopefully, there's going to be content I'll be putting up going forward. Um, all right. So ERAS CV. One of the early misconceptions that people have about the ERAS CV is, and maybe something that they're not aware of, is that it has a standardized format. There's really no format you have to come up with. You just put in text and information in boxes. I'm just going to hide this here. So there's just, this thing just keeps popping up. Let me just kind of fix it. Okay, now. So, there's just text you put in text boxes and the system creates a CV for you guys. What's important though, and what people don't seem to realize, is it's equally important how you organize all this information on your application, and you have, although there are not a lot of formatting options, there are a few things you can definitely do to make sure your application is organized, it's readable, and it flows nicely, because that's very important. Programs receive 6,000, 7,000 applications, many of them, and you want to make sure that your application is not a struggle to go through. It's very easy to read through. It gives the important information that programs need to know, from you, and without mentioning too much nor too little. So before I go ahead, I would just want to fix this video control panel. That's that. Just give me a moment, guys. Okay. Now, I would like to begin with a few main tips. The first thing is to prioritize which experiences to mention and which ones not to. Now, a lot of you guys must have gone, you've gone through 5 years, 6 years maybe of med school, and you've taken part in a lot of different activities. You want to mention, obviously, first of all, the most important activities to you. And what do I mean by most important? These are activities that reflect the most about you, that reflect the most positive about you, and reflect your qualities of, commitment, dedication, resilience, discipline, leadership, and are relevant to the program. A program is most interested in, first of all, looking at your clinical experience, at your research experience, at your volunteering, but obviously volunteering that is at least even loosely related to medicine or stuff that you would be doing in medicine. And experiences that you had to use your qualities in, which are also relevant to your residency. Now, again, when we talk about leadership, talk about creativity, discipline, commitment, good communication skills, all these, are valuable. So you want to mention experiences that reflect a lot about you. And there'll be a point where you'll have so many different experiences on your under your belt, and you would need to prioritize which ones you want to mention, which ones not. Because the problem with mentioning too many experiences is that it sometimes takes the focus away from the most important, the best experiences you have. Now, for example, if I'm I'm reading an application and someone has mentioned, let's say there are two applicants. One has mentioned 3 top experiences which highlight a lot about them. It is basically tells me so much. It's very impressive what they've done. It's great stuff, and I can focus on those 3. I can read through them, and even when I interview that applicant, I'm able to talk about it. I was like, hey, by the way, you mentioned this. What? How about tell me more about it? And they will be able to more passionately talk about that experience. On the other hand, someone who has mentioned, let's say, 10 experiences, and out of those 10, maybe let's say 3 of them were their best experiences, and the other 7 are just like, old experiences. Maybe they had just passive involvement in those. And let's say as an interviewer, I'm reading the application and I come across one of those, side less important experiences, and I bring that up in the interview, and I'm like, hey, by the way, you mentioned this. How about you talk about it? Now, that's not their biggest and best experience, but I've put them in a position where they need to talk about it. And they may not be able to be very convincing and strong when they talk about that particular experience. So you want to keep in mind all the things you include in your CV, because remember, anything can be brought up in the interview. So use that to your advantage. Mention things you can passionately talk about. You can things that truly reflect your personality, your identity, who you are as a person, and the qualities that you bring to the program. So that would be really for, tip number one. I'm just gonna take a moment and hide this panel because it keeps popping. Um, how do I do that? Just give me a moment, guys. Okay. So that would be point one. Point number two would be avoiding being redundant and wordy. Now, I'll show you some examples from my application as to how I, discussed and presented some of my involvements. And it's important to give enough detail, but you have to make sure to not be too wordy or redundant, where you're just mentioning the same thing over and over again, right? Or you're mentioning details that are not exactly relevant, or you're mentioning details that are like better suited for a personal statement. When we just spoke about reflecting on your experiences for a personal statement. For a CV, you don't need to reflect on on an experience. You don't need to elaborate on how hot warming it was or things you learned. No, a CV is more objective. You have to list down your experiences, present the most important details, and move on. um, okay. Next point is going to be keeping it clean and organized. So as I said, there's not a lot of formatting options you have at your availability on ERAS, but you can still use a few tricks to make sure your descriptions are organized. They are easy to read. For example, a simple example is using a numbered list. One dot, mention your stuff, two dot, mention stuff, three dots, so on. That really, I think, makes a big difference. Instead of everything being in a big block of paragraphs, it's better if they're like in a numbered list. I'll again show you examples. Finally, my final tip would be that get your application reviewed by people who are close to you, people who know you well, people who can give you advice about your application, because it's important. Honestly, I got my application reviewed by several of my seniors, and the feedback I got from them was amazing. It was very important to me. I at some point had mentioned unnecessary details that don't add value but just take space. You get me? So you want to avoid doing that, and for that, it's very advisable that you get your application reviewed by seniors and trusted people. um, in addition to that, make sure the language, the grammar is appropriate. There are no mistakes, because obviously that can also be as a negative. When programs review your application, they want to make sure that you take note of small details, minor details. You have an eye for detail. Then you can demonstrate that by having an application which has no mistakes. Now, basically, I'm going to take you guys through some different sections of the application. Obviously, you guys, especially those who are applying for the match right now, are probably aware, but I'll just touch on a few points as we go through those. So obviously, you have the personal information where you mention your name, email, contact. A lot of people will recommend that you create a new email address for your ERAS application season, because you'll be getting a lot of emails on programs, interviews. They send you some more information about their program, and additional emails with information. So I did that. I started a new email account, and it wasn't like dedicated for the match, but it was a new one because I had an old one which was like overloaded. I had like 50,000 unread emails. It was like the damage was beyond repair. So I needed a new email account, and I made that, used that for my match season. When that was done, I'm just using that now, as a regular account for almost everything. So that's an advice. Address, mentioning your mailing and permanent address. Programs will receive this, and there was a few, actually just one program, Mayo Clinic Arizona, that mailed me a packet with some like welcome. This was like, I think this was before my interview, but although like after I received the interview invitation. So this was a packet with like a booklet on Arizona, some other nice free stuff like a free Mayo pen and stuff like that. And I had mentioned my aunt's address in New York at that time, and by that time I had moved personally to Virginia, but the packet went to my aunt in New York, which was fine. But the point is, make sure that the mailing address or permanent address. There's this recommendation that try to have a US address on file. If you can mention a US address, whether it's a family member or it's like maybe a close friend or something, I think programs will just maybe like to see that you have a local address, maybe. So if that's a possibility, I would think there's no harm in doing that. So try to see if you can mention a US address for your address. Next is citizenship information, whether you need a visa or not. This is where you indicate it. Then you talk about whether you're applying as a couple or individually, and then your ECFMG ID, BLS, ACLS, so on. Now, many might ask, is this important? Do I have to have BLS? Honestly, it's not very important because I remember mine was expiring like midway through the interview season, and I had still mentioned it, but it really is no big deal because all programs will make you do a BLS, when you are about going to start residency. So if you have it, cool. If you don't, like, I don't know how much value it adds to your application. Then biographical information, gender, birthplace, birth date, ethnicity, language fluency. This is where you mentioned if you speak multiple languages. It can be a nice conversation starter, honestly. And that's something, I use to my advantage. Hobbies and interests. We'll touch on why hobbies are very important, and you should not overlook that section. You should talk about hobbies very seriously because a lot of programs want to, when you interview with them, they want to see who you are as a person. What kind of hobbies do you have? What kind of interests do you have? They know they're interviewing you because you are good already to them. They know you're good. They like your credentials. They just now want to see how you are as a person. Do you have interests? So hobbies is a great place to touch on that. And we'll talk about what's the best way to present your hobbies. It's not just simply just mentioning. I remember seeing an example where it was like, I like cooking and playing with my family and going out with friends, and I reading and watching movies. And these are not hobbies. These are just list of things you often do. Hobbies are your interests that you do regularly and you derive pleasure and happiness from. So it's important that you have a specific list of hobbies that you can reflect on, because in interviews you might be asked to elaborate on those and they might have you talk about your hobbies, which is pretty common. Honestly, a lot of people get that. Then we have education, where you will mention if you have any prior education, any previous degrees. A lot of us, went from med school directly to residency application. So, and many of us go from high school to med school. So we don't do like a pre-med or like a bachelor's degree before. So in that case, you won't have essentially much to add there. So now talking about hobbies. Hobbies are very important because they can tell programs what kind of person you are, what kind of hobbies you have. And it's important to mention them in a way which shows that these are truly your hobbies. You do these very seriously. This is an example, someone might say, I like running. But if you add to that and say that you participated in a local marathon recently to support like city tourism plan, it just tells more about you, and you can use that to your advantage to even reflect the good qualities that you have. For me, my hobbies that I mentioned were photography, graphic designing, and soccer. Graphic designing, and I mentioned what kind of softwares I work with: Illustrator, Photoshop, and I design logos and posters. Photography, I mentioned I used a Canon EOS 550D before, and my main eh, interests in photography are landscape photography, architecture, and so on, and event photography. And one of the program directors asked me about my hobbies. I told him about graphic designing, and he was like, "Hey, I used to do graphic designing too." I was like, "Oh, that's awesome. You know what? I'm going to email you some of my work." And I actually emailed him some of the logos I made. And he was like, "Oh, that's very impressive work," and stuff like that. So it was nice. It was nice, kind of point to connect on, and ice breaking. So do not underestimate your hobbies. Make sure you pay attention and to what you include in your hobbies, because quite often you will be told to elaborate on your hobbies. Next is, so then we have the experience section of your application, where you're going to talk about your work experience, volunteering, and your research. Under work, you have basically any clinical electives, clinical experience you might have had previously, and teaching experience also goes here, as well as any paid jobs that you might have had before. Volunteering basically is any extracurricular activities, you might have served on any student committees, student groups, organizations. It all goes there. Uh, Keep in mind, there are short-term experiences and there are long-term experiences. There are some things you do. Let's say you volunteered for like an event for 2 days, and then on the other hand, you served on a student committee, educational committee for a year or two. That is obviously, I think, to me, more valuable. Long-term involvements are more valuable than short, small experiences. Um, then we have research experience. Here you'll talk about any summer research internships you might have done, research fellowships, research trainee positions. A lot of you guys do that when applying to the match. You spend a few months during your interview season doing research, and that's something you can talk about here. So how do you describe your experiences? As we previously discussed and mentioned, that you want to avoid being redundant and wordy, but also you want to give programs the most important details. So you neither want to be too short, nor too you don't want them to be either too short or too long. So an example is, if someone says, "I attended 1 month of GI rotation as a final year med student." That's one way of putting it, but really doesn't tell me much about what the experience was like, and doesn't tell me more about how involved you were. On the other hand, this is a more favorable example where you talk about how many weeks and what your your end of rotation evaluation was, and now the nature of the experience. Was it inpatient, outpatient, and we saw procedures? And did you participate in any departmental activities, like the academic activities they do for residents and stuff? And what exactly did you do during your rotation? Did you write notes? Did you see patients? Did you communicate with different departments? And did you plan management and care and stuff? And quantify, talk about how many patients you saw per day, because it gives them an idea of truly what was the volume of the patients you were seeing and how much experience. It puts things in perspective, because then they can tell, okay, this student really had a very thorough clinical experience. Next, I'm going to give you an example from my application. This was my elective at Mayo, back in September, October. And as you can see, I described my experience in 4 points. And take note of the tone that I use and the way I structured the sentences. For example, the first one is rotated in the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine. I did not say I rotated in. These are just extra words that can be removed, and it won't change your text in any way. So be direct. Rotated in, worked on the inpatient service, and I did those things, and I was responsible for those things. And then conducted daily evaluation of 3 to 4 assigned patients, and I did so and so and so. And obviously presented my cases on the rounds with the team. And fourth, I presented on the topics genetics of familial hypercholesterolemia and management of acute and refractory pericarditis. So it kind of gives them an overall view of my elective. It tells them more than just me doing an elective and being there. So it kind of tells them that how much volume of, how much patient volume I was seeing, what my academic involvements were in the elective, and so on. So just an example, you guys might even be able to do better than this. But an example to show you that it's important to be direct, important to avoid too many words. I could have mentioned a lot more. I could have talked about what kind of cases I saw. I could have talked about other stuff, but at some point you just have to find the balance. These things I actually then spoke about in my interview, so it worked out. So mention the most important stuff. And as we discussed, how you want to fill your experiences, try to mention the most important details, be objective and specific, quantify numbers and percentages are always very nice. This also applies to your other experiences. I'll show you another example in a bit, and make sure it's readable, make sure it's easy to read. I cannot emphasize that enough. And I think that's probably the most important takeaway from today's workshop is that make sure your application is readable and it's easy to read. And you can get an idea about that by having people review your application. When they review your application, they'll be able to tell you, look, you mentioned these details, but they don't add much to your application, so you might consider removing them. Or you mentioned this, but try to mention it in a different way. So readability is very important. Here's another example from my volunteering experience. So back in med school at Alfaisal, we had the clinical training program, which was eventually merged with the research committee to make international office as you know today. So I described my experience as the director of the program and my responsibilities. And then I mentioned oversaw training scholarships of over so-and-so $1,000. And that gives them an idea of how much money went into this program. So definitely must have been important for the med school since they were putting money into it. And I mentioned some of the institutions we partnered with. And the second point was, as part of my directorship, I founded the Residency Preparatory Course US. So the CGS, the Career Guidance Series you see today, which this webinar is part of, essentially is really an adaptation of the RPC we used to do. The RPC was like a in-person course and went from A to Z. The CGS is a more fluid version of that, which kind of touches on different topics and is virtual. People can access from everywhere. So this was a 2-day course delivered by university alumni who have been accepted in US residency. And again, I quantified by telling them more than 200 students participated in the course. Fourth part of your application is going to be licensure. Is if you're licensed, if you were licensed previously, mainly in the US anywhere, and publications. Now, the thing about publications is, keep in mind that any research experience you're involved in is valuable, even if there are papers you are in the process of writing, if there are papers you have submitted, not published yet, you can mention those. That's the amazing thing, because when you put them on ERAS, it'll say what the status of this paper is. Is it published, not submitted, in process, so on. So make use of that. If there are papers or research projects you're working on right now, include them in your application. And then programs, if they're interested, they can talk, ask about it in the interviews. But also keep in mind that any publication you'll put in, there's a chance that you'll be asked to talk about it. And I was asked to talk about my publications quite frequently. When I had the opportunity, I would choose the one I'm most comfortable talking about. Otherwise, if they pick on a certain publication, I would have to speak about that. And when I mentioned that programs and interviews ask you about publications, well, believe me, it was very conversational. They didn't ask for specifics. They didn't be like, oh, what was your sample size like? Why did you guys choose to structure your study design like this? No, it's very conversational. It's as if you describing the research to a friend, because I think that's the basic expectation. If you're involved in a research, you should at least know enough to be able to talk about it with a friend. And that's really how it's going to be in your interview. It's as if you're describing it to a friend. Okay. So don't stress too much about it. As long as you know the general idea about the publication, the project, you should be fine. So as you can see, there are different kinds of publications you can talk about: papers, posters, abstracts, oral presentations. If you write on like online on websites and stuff, which are not like scientific publications, they can still be considered here. Now, documents, looking at the documents, again, this is just, the more technical dry side of things today, but you guys probably are aware. Personal statement, you can add as many versions of personal statements you want. We spoke about that in the previous workshop. uh, Feel free. My approach was, I had, let's say, I think I had like 10 versions of my personal statement. They were all the same, but I just changed like the institution name for the top institutions I was applying to, like Mayo, Cleveland, Cornell, Yale, Hopkins, and stuff. So I would just change the name. I didn't try making them very personalized, but I think that would be a smart thing to do if you're very interested in going to a certain program, certain city, certain state. It's reasonable to personalize your personal statement, talking about the city, why you love the city, if you have family in the state, and so on. It just helps re-emphasize, reinforce your interest in the program, in the city, and in the state. And then LORs, there's an online process through which you request faculty to upload LORs. I think the recommendation is always that you have them waived, uh, so that you're not able to see them. Basically, that kind of maybe gives programs more confidence in them. But keep in mind, there'll be some faculty who will be kind enough to just send you, personally, your LOR that they wrote for you. They'll be like, look, this is what I wrote. Does it look okay? Cool. I'm gonna go ahead and upload it. So you'll find faculty like that. So that's a nice thing to do for them. But some may be more obedient to the rule of waiving your right to see the letter, and you may not be able to see the letter. But as long as there are some signs that will tell you that a faculty must have written a good letter for you. If they offered to write a letter, if they're like, hey, do you need a letter? I can write one. Secondly, if they actually looked at your CV, if they asked for your CV or you send them your CV and they looked at it, they will be able to write a more personalized letter for you. So it's just stuff like that. Then there are some additional documents like the transcript that is kind of just, you just have to authorize the release and then it's updated itself. MSPE to be uploaded by your med school, transcript by your med school, photo you have to upload, and then ECMG status report is something that's updated, regularly based on your status. Photo, what can we say about photos? There are some articles online that you'll come across about what's the best kind of setup for photos. Essentially, a light background is preferred. A front facing view is important. Things like smiling, showing your teeth, maybe, I think can be a nice impression, can set a nice impression on programs. Please, if you need to invest in a good professional photo for your ERAS, this is probably the most important photo you're going to be taking up until this point. So do not stand, like if I were to stand in front of this white wall and take a selfie and then edit that and upload that, I wouldn't think that would be a smart thing to do. Although I could make it work, but I think I would rather avoid that. I would get a proper professional nice picture taken for these purposes. I did that for my dad though once, I remember. But we used a professional camera for that at home, so that was like different. But just try to take note of that, just try to invest on a good picture. Now, obviously, we talked about those documents. Some of these will be uploaded by your med school, some automatically updated, and some things that you'll have to upload yourself. The MSP, obviously, is something that you'd have to check with your med school on. The way our med school used to do it is they had a format, they had a template in place that they would populate with information, but then they would have you review it and see if anything needs to be changed, and then they would upload it. So just make sure your med school is doing it right, because I think generally a lot of med schools are absolutely clueless as to how to do an MSPE. So make sure that that is not one of the reasons why programs put applications aside. Make sure your med schools know what to do. On the other hand, obviously, there's an option, I believe, of you doing your MSPs yourself, for people whose med schools are not doing it. So even then, just make sure you follow the rules laid out by ERAS and RMP. And as long as you keep it simple and provide them the information they need, you should be fine. Okay. Programs, my colleague, Dr. Riyad Habib, I believe a few days ago, gave a very good presentation on working on your program lists. So, I won't elaborate too much on that, but obviously, you will be able to search for programs on ERAS and add them to your list. I think the ERAS application system is pretty nice. It does the job. It's a good one. I think generally it helps you filter and helps you sort programs in different ways. Um, so it's always nice, though. I noticed that for some programs, the information they had on ERAS was kind of outdated. Some of them were like, "Oh, I was applying in 2020." They were like, "Welcome to the 2019 ERAS season." I was like, "It's not even updated." So you would want to make sure that you're looking at the most recent information. Is usually always ideal and advisable for you to go to the program website and kind of check the information there. And if you even need to, reach out to the program for more information if needed. Now, again, when talking about the program list, things you want to look at are basically, if you're an IMG, you want to ensure that you have a lot of programs in your application which are IMG friendly. You may choose to apply to some non-IMG friendly places like I did. That is perfectly fine. But obviously, there needs to be a good number of IMG friendly programs that are known to take IMGs. If they're programs who've taken graduates from your med school before, that's an additional plus, so you should be considering those programs as well. Look at the curriculum, look at what visa they sponsor, what application criteria do they have. And so what I've noticed is a lot of programs are, some of them are very strict with the criteria. Some are like, and they're flexible. They will, it's if they say 250 plus, maybe they don't necessarily mean exactly 250 plus. They may look at lower in the right context. If it's a candidate with other good things in their application with a slightly lower score, it's likely they will still consider that applicant. So I obviously kept that in my mind when looking at the criteria, but you want to assess how many programs you already have on your list and how many more you want to apply to, and just pay attention to the criteria, but not too much. Don't over hyper focus on the criteria numerically, like, oh, they mentioned this. I think quite often things are flexible. It's always the case. If someone puts in a word for you, you get an interview despite whatever criteria they have in place and whatever your application is like. That happens in many places. Fellowship placements. If you're interested in fellowships, you would want to see if it's a program which also has fellowship programs in the future. That would be a nice bonus for you. Activities, city and the state. If you have family in a nearby state or in the same state, do you like the city that the program is in? Do you see yourself living there? Because believe me, before you even work in residency, you're going to be living in that place. You want to be in a place that is livable to you, that meets your preferences for a place you would like to live in. And if you have family, that's obviously another consideration. And you'll get information from the program website, but if not, then there are other places like Frida, like Residency Explorer, and so on. I didn't use Frida. I just used Residency Explorer just to look at the IMG percentage, nothing more than that, honestly. And just to get a relative idea of where I stand, because they give you those percentiles, 25th percentile, 50th percentile. That was good enough. Otherwise, I didn't like hyper focus on these things. Now, let's talk about something new, the hot news in town, the ERAS supplemental application. Well, given that I'm not an applicant this year, I may not know everything about it, but what I could say is it's a positive step in my opinion, because up until this point, there was no particular part in your application where you would be able to indicate, express to the programs you're very interested in that you're interested in them and what are the reasons for that. The only way to do that would be to email programs, and let them know like, hey, I'm interested in your program. My spouse works in the same city, so I would really want to match there. But quite often they're overloaded with emails, and quite often I think the emails just go like unnoticed. So it's a positive step. It'll just, I think, improve uh, how well people match to programs and programs match to people, right? Programs will be able to get better fitting candidates and people will be able to get better fitting programs. So hopefully a positive experience and positive change. I think it's only for GS, internal medicine, and Derma so far. So, they're still trying and testing how this will work this year. So, you know, I think something interesting, and something you can use to your advantage if you mention the right things and if you send the right preference signals to programs. Geographic information has always been like something that I think plays a role, definitely. And many programs will look at that. For example, I when I was doing an elective at Mayo, there was a cardiology fellow who was then going on to sub fellowship. He was applying to his EP electrophysiology fellowship at that point, and so basically he had applied to some programs. He got very good interviews from very good places, um, mainly from the West Coast and the Arizona side, Arizona area, Texas, Arizona. But there was a program he really wanted to interview at on the East Coast, but he noticed he didn't receive an interview from them. And he reached out to them and he told them like, hey, like, I hope you guys looked at my application. And he was a very good applicant. And I hope you looked at my application. But I wonder, if you actually reviewed it. And the program got back to him saying, oh, we felt that maybe you may not be interesting to moving to East Coast, given your location. But that wasn't true. He would have been happy to move. But it's just those kind of preconceived notions that maybe programs sometimes have when they look at your geographical, status. So it helps indicating if you truly have a geographic preference, cool, say so. If you don't, then say so. So what I heard was about the supplemental application. If you do indicate a geographical preference, let's say if you indicate a preference for the East Coast, only the East Coast programs will know you've indicated that. No other programs will not know that you have a geographical preference. If you indicate that you have no geographical preference, all your programs will know you don't have a geographical preference. So yeah, and it also, the supplemental application also allows you to talk about the most meaningful work, helps you highlight some top experiences, which is very nice, I think, and then helps you send preference signals to a few programs, so they can review your application. So use it wisely. If you're planning to use supplemental application, use it wisely to your advantage. Don't overthink it, because it's the first year. It's experimental. It's a pilot test. So everyone will be taking this with a grain of salt, very carefully. So that's that about the supplemental application. How are you doing on time? Good. That basically brings me to the end of my talk on the ERAS CV. I hope I covered, it appropriately. I touched on the important topics and shared my input and tips that I feel are important when you go about working on your your ERAS application. You've come very far. You have amazing experiences. You've worked very hard so far, and I'm very proud of you all. Now is just a time to put everything together and use this application to your advantage. You have everything it takes, but you just now need to let the programs know what you have and who you are as a person. What kind of experiences do you bring to the program? So pay attention to your application. This is one of the most important stages in this whole process. You've done steps, you've done electives, research, everything. So just make sure that all that comes together at this climax of your journey through this process, and try to attract attention towards your strongest qualities and experiences and away from your weak points. That's generally the approach, so you can impress the programs. So thank you very much, guys. We will now take questions. I believe there are plenty of questions in the chat box, and let's see where our discussion takes us. Okay. All right. Let's see. A lot of questions. It's always like this, and I enjoy it. I truly appreciate you guys asking questions, because I think that's really the point of this webinar, for you guys to get answers to your questions. Rawan asks, 10 experiences, you mean 10 for each of work, volunteer, research? No, that was an example. I was giving an example when I said, let's say if someone has 10 in total, an example. I think that would be outrageous to have 10 for each. For example, I had, for my work experience, maybe I had like 2 or 3. For my research, I had 2. For my what do you call it? For my volunteering, I had maybe 4 or 5. So yeah, obviously not 10 per experience. Ahmed asks, how many volunteering minimal do we need? Can you please tell us the number needed for each? Honestly, there is no number needed. You decide. But my advice is to not make it too long. As long as, let's say, as long as you've mentioned, let's say, because each of them are different nature of experiences. So work experience, if you have like 2 or 3, now that depends on the electives you've done. I did only 1 elective, so I had only 1 elective experience on my work experience. If you've done 2 or 3 electives, you're going to be having more. So it depends on each applicant. And then there is volunteering experience. Obviously, you want to see, if you have a lot of volunteering experience, just focus on the most important and most relevant ones. So I'd say for volunteering, maybe like 4 or 5 should be max. I don't think you should be mentioning more than that, honestly. Research depends on what research internships you've done before in the US. You can talk about those. So I hope that answers the question. Nilofar asks, how many electives or observerships should we have? Now that takes us to a totally different discussion on electives and USCE, but I'll give you a short answer. Enough to get you enough letters of recommendation from the US to apply. COVID has changed how programs looked at USCE. Before, it was recommended that before COVID, it would be like, oh, you should be doing at least 3. At least 3 is a nice number, because that'll help you get enough LORs. COVID changed everything. A lot of people had no electives and they matched. Some had telerotations, observerships, and they matched. I had only 1 elective and I was able to match. And luckily, everything went well. I was able to get multiple letters from 1 month of electives. So for everyone, it works differently, but COVID has changed how we look at electives and clinical experience. The more, the better, obviously, but that comes at a cost of money, time, and it takes you away from maybe the other requirements you're trying to fulfill. Let's say someone's trying to study for step 2, but still they're doing electives, so just kind of puts them in a difficult situation. So you want to assess your circumstances and see how many electives you've done and how many you would like to do more, but just enough to get you the letters you need and enough to help you support your interest in that specialty. Eddie, it was hard to get USCE since last year because of COVID. Is USCE critical for applicants? As I just mentioned, COVID changed a lot of things, and programs really know that. Believe me, a lot of people matched without electives. But obviously, it helps to have electives because it helps you to get LORs, US letters of recommendation, that you definitely, it's very advisable to have for your application. Yunhee, I hope that I pronounced the name correctly. I'm sorry if I butchered it. How to describe our research experiences? What can be counted as a research experience? Could I put statistical analysis education into the research experience section? So it would depend on what involvement you had. Now, there's another question that stems from it is, if I have a publication and I was very involved in that publication, can I mention that as a research experience? Well, in some way, yes, you can, but obviously you would have to word it in a way that truly reflects, what how involved you were. Otherwise, it's kind of obvious that you got a publication out of it, so you must have been involved enough to do, to get a publication. But when you're trying to describe your research experiences, first it'll depend on whether it was a clinical experience, a clinical research, or basic research. So one of the things you can mention is what department you worked in, what project you worked in, what was the project about. For example, when I was at Mayo for a summer, I worked basic research on a project that looked at ER stress and human area smooth muscle cells. So you can just kind of introduce the idea a bit without being too detailed. Then you can talk about what hands-on techniques you got experience with, like confocal microscopy, like cell culturing, like PCR, electrophoresis. What did you do as part of that research? Third would be if you actually gave some presentations. I gave a presentation when I was at Mayo for research, and you could talk about what topics you presented on to the in the lab meeting. Um, what else? So when you ask about statistical analysis education into the research experience section, I would just want to understand: did you provide statistical analysis education, and in what format? Did you give a course? Did you give lectures on statistical analyses? Or did you run the statistical analysis for certain projects? Usually, that would be one of the things you do as part of being on a project, as I mentioned, those different things. And some projects, if your involvement was very intensive, like let's say a project you came up with the idea for, you got the IRB approval, you collected data, you analyzed the data, and you wrote the manuscript. Now that's like a full-blown, project that you worked on very significantly. So I think some stuff like that, I think, can be mentioned in your research experience. But quite often, we come in, we do our part, and paper gets published. Sometimes we just do the manuscript writing and paper gets published. So I personally wouldn't mention something like that in my research experiences if I wasn't very extremely involved in the project. If I was, then I would potentially consider mentioning it in my research experience. Damla, any tip for hands-on USC for already graduates? There are some, obviously I know after graduation it gets kind of technical to get hands-on electives. But I do know of many friends who apply to these observerships. So observerships really kind of depend on the physician you're working with. They may be comfortable enough for you to get some hands-on, and by hands-on I mean history taking and physical. There's not much more than that. In my Mayo elective as a med student, I did the same thing. I didn't do any procedures or anything. It was just history taking and looking at the chart and physicals. So even through your observerships, you might be able to get hands-on, which is really the case with one of my close friends right now doing observerships, and he was able to do plenty of hands-on. So that's one thing. Secondly, observerships can open a door, as I said, to maybe more hands-on rotations by your doctor connecting you with other people who might be able to help you better. But obviously all that needs to be within legal limits. I'm not a legal advisor as to what the legality is of that, of people doing hands-on, and in what setting. Is it like a teaching setting? Is it supervised? Stuff like that. So you would want to keep that in mind. But as a graduate, as long as you get some observerships experiences, you should be good. And here's the thing though. On paper, the title might be observership, but that does not matter if the attending you worked with will write you a letter which says that you did hands-on, you did physical, you did histories of patients and stuff like that. So, it doesn't matter what you're applying to. It depends on what you eventually do, through the rotation. Hamid asks, would reading be considered as a hobby? Of course, it would be a hobby. And now, to kind of support that hobby, you could talk about what your favorite books are, what kind of books you like reading, and how many books you've read so far, stuff like that, just to give them an idea. Andrea says, is it important to mention the time you spend in volunteering? I mean, hours per week that ERAS asks you. Honestly, no. I think it's an optional thing. I did not mention that for all my volunteering because I was like thinking about it when I was writing it. I was like, how much time did I even spend? Okay, if I spent like 5 hours every day for the week, and then how much does that add up to? I don't think it's necessary, to be honest, but it also depends on the nature of the volunteering. If those were long-term volunteering, like it's very obvious you worked on it for 1 year, then I think it's kind of obvious you spent a lot of time on it. If it was like a more a shorter kind of experience, then you might consider mentioning the hours you worked, and I think that's when it becomes more relevant. Keela asks, how can I write my research experience, pre-med school fellowship, then that most of them did not publish? Um, hmm. So if they did not publish, and if you don't see them getting published, uh, and if the experience was pretty involving, as in you were involved in the experience through, um, lab, if this was a basic science project and you worked at the lab, did techniques, and you presented maybe a poster or something, or presented in the lab, so you can, these are the things you can mention as a research experience. And at the same time, you will need to eventually prioritize. If someone has enough publications, has some research experience, they may just consider, hey, some old experiences, maybe I don't want to mention them, I don't need to mention them actually. So yeah, just kind of look at your application, see what you have already and where this fits in, and accordingly, if it's in process, you can mention it in the publications as in progress. If it has kind of like stalled, then think about it, and think if how much benefit you gained out of it. Because if you were to be asked about it in the interview, and if they ask about the progress of the project and they realize maybe it wasn't finished, maybe it would be like something they'll be like, oh, okay, it was a project you worked on, but it didn't lead to completion. So Amna asks, how would you go about describing telerotation, since due to COVID-19 there have been a rise of telerotations instead of hands-on? That's very true. um, Now looking at it from like if I wasn't attending, or if I was a PD, looking, reviewing telerotations, and people talking about telerotations, I would want to see a very good amount of engagement. And one way that will support that is your LORs from your PDs. When they in their LOR will write that you were very involved, you were very engaged in the discussion, you took histories from patients, and because I think even LORs are, I mean, telerotations are also structured differently. Some let you be in a one-on-one connection with patients, and you're able to take a history and stuff like that. So if that was the case, you can talk about how many patients you saw per day. You can talk about how you were involved. If you presented, you know virtually to the team through on your telerotation on certain topics, talk about it. Talk about how you were, did you have access to the system, the electronic medical record system. Talk about what kind of patients you saw, how many patients you saw per day. The volume will be important. So even if it was telerotation and you were seeing like 20, 30, 40 patients per day, it's still like very extensive clinical experience. And right now, there's also a discussion happening as to what's the difference then between an observership, like a true observership, where you don't do anything, versus a telerotation. It's very similar then. So telerotations can be valuable, but you just need to highlight on those topics. Nilufer asks, how does knowing Spanish help you match in US universities? Well, I think looking back, if I go back, I'd love to learn Spanish, because I think it's very relevant. And I think a lot of programs, especially primary care programs, programs in like underserved, underprivileged areas, really appreciate if you know Spanish, because it means a lot to your, patients. You'll be able to communicate with patients without and the need of an interpreter, and that makes things a bit easier. So Spanish is definitely a nice addition to your application. Obviously, it doesn't compensate for other big things like LORs or like scores, research, and whatnot, but it's a nice addition. Next question by M is, if most research experiences didn't lead to publications, will it look negatively? Also, will experiences in other specialties give an impression that you are not committed to intended specialty? Good questions. First one is, if there's like this trend of a lot of someone who was on a lot of projects, but they did not lead to publications consistently, there's a problem. And they meant the problem may not be with the applicant, it may be with the people they were working with, maybe there was no consistency, lack of commitment, whatever it is. But it would be concerning, to see that someone who was involved in a lot of projects, but they didn't lead to publication. And these are projects like that were done a long time ago. It would be a concerning point, but I think a lot of programs will just maybe not even notice that. But if it was me, I would probably ask the applicant, like, what is this about? How did that happen? On the other hand, just if you want to avoid the trouble altogether, you want to kind of reassess and see how many of those you want to mention. Do you want to mention all of those incomplete projects that stalled and did not progress, or you can mention a few and just leave it there, in addition to everything else that you've done that is in progress or that might have been published. So think about it. Next question: if one did the same volunteer work on and off and over an extended period, how to indicate the date since it's in the format of month, year to month, year? If it was on and off an extended period, depending on how frequently you're doing it, you could just go from like the moment you started it. Let's say you started in 2018 and you did it in 2020. So you would then, mention that whole period. Basically, you wouldn't need to mention specific dates and like specific times you were doing the volunteering. You could, if you want to clarify further, you could talk about that in the work, in the hours worked per week. That would give a better idea about how much of an involvement was it from your end over the year, basically. Kyla asks, I'm in the process writing paper. How can I select? So if you're writing a paper in the publication section, you will be able to mention all the details, author, title, and then in the status, it'll say, I think in process or in progress or something like that. And if you think by the time you're getting interviewed or by the time you submit your application, it will be submitted, then you can mention submitted as a status. Damla asks, if we add non-medical journals to publication section 2, can we add? Yeah, I mean, for sure you can add, you can definitely add them. And it might be something that might intrigue programs, and they would be happy to know more about it. And so I think you can definitely add them. There's no harm. Every publication counts. Look, so like, there's a point where you need to have some publications there on your application. As long as you have those, you're good. And in the beginning, I couldn't have been choosy. So I had a few publications, very few in cardiology, one in pediatrics and adolescent health, but I still included it because it was just a nice publication. I didn't have many publications. So I needed a bigger number. So I mentioned whatever I had. I wasn't in a position to be, picky or choosy. iPhone asks, what is a good volunteering experience? Can you please give examples for us to be able to prioritize while listing? Good question. I would say, here's the thing. First one would be experiences that are somehow medically related. Some very popular ones are relief work. If you go to a place which is underserved, underprivileged, a lot of people go to certain parts of Africa, to Asia, and they work in a free healthcare camp, let's say healthcare camp for refugees and stuff. This is very good stuff. Secondly is community service. If you're in the community running, vaccination drives and free health checkups, also very good. I'll give you an idea about my experiences. And I felt I always, initially in first year of medicine, I started off doing photography. I was doing photography for the magazine, the newsletter. It was fun. I was doing it for fun, but then second year, third year, I realized I would need to focus more on things that will benefit me more in the future. So although my volunteering experiences weren't all medically related, but one of them, I was the president of the Quality and Patient Safety Program at our med school. And through that, we basically try to educate med students about patient safety and how it's very important, how they need to actively think about it. And we used to organize lectures, workshops, awareness campaigns, competitions to make it fun, and also try to get them involved in research and stuff like that. So that was basically one. The second one, as I shared in my application, it was the clinical training program. This was a program basically that tried to secure electives, observerships for our med students. How we did that is by reaching out to programs in the US and hospitals and kind of arranging agreements, and we would select students, put them through a selection process, and then send them out. We would partially fund them through the university funding. And so and I was the director of the program. So this highlighted several things. One, really leadership experience. Second, interpersonal skills, communication, commitment, responsibility. We were overseeing a certain amount of money. Money was involved in this, so we had to make sure we are very careful with it. So it's just qualities like those. So I would say the possibilities are endless. Choose volunteering experiences that will reflect good qualities about you: leadership, good communication skills, an ability to empathize with patients, connect with people, diligence, commitment, responsibility, discipline, and an eagerness to learn. Anything education related is very nice. So I hope this gives you an idea. Stephen says, I defended a thesis for my MD degree in front of the cardiology commission, 3 of the professors and peers. Can I state that as an oral presentation? It's a very good question, and I feel you might be able to. Yeah, I think that that's a very valuable form of oral presentation, and short answer would be you should be able to mention that in an oral presentation. M says, should all non-medical experiences and accomplishments in the hobby be in the hobbies, or can they be mentioned in corresponding sections along with medical experiences? Let me try to understand the question. All non-medical experiences and accomplishments and the hobbies. Well, you also have the med school awards and accomplishment section, and then there are also like this section at the end, I believe, where you can also list other accomplishments. So you have 2 of those. Non-medical, if it's teaching, it can go under work experience. So I hope that answers the question. I hope I understood the question and answered it appropriately. Dr. A asks, should I mention my student newsletter articles, MedTimes as publications? I would recommend, in the context of how many publications you have, you may not even need to do that. And if you're already mentioning your experience as a writer for the newsletter as one of your volunteering, you may still not need to do that, because you can just mention the topics there under that experience. But if those were articles very relevant to medicine, maybe I would think in the right context you could mention them in your publications. Dr. Madam asks, what would be a good number of publications for IM, light background? People match with zero publications, people match with a lot of publications. So I would say that's a difficult question to answer. And for every program, it would be a different answer. If it's a community program, if it's like a primary care program, they may not care as much about publications as other academically oriented programs that are research heavy. But I'd say, a safe number would be 2 to 3. That's a 2. If you have some publications, 2 is a decent number, And I think if you look at the NRMP data and look at the average number of publications, it's probably around a similar number for applicants. Stephen asks, also, I published an article in local newspapers about COVID pseudo pandemic. Can I put that somewhere in the CV? So depending on how consistently you did that and how many articles you wrote, you could talk about it. You can mention you were like a columnist or like a writer for a newspaper in your experience, or you can mention that in your publications and indicate that it was a newspaper you wrote for. iPhone asks, does a poster presentation on research day count as a publication too? It does not. It counts as a poster presentation under the publications. So yeah, it's not a publication itself, but it will be a poster presentation. And I included one of those. I presented a poster on research day, and I mentioned that under my poster presentations. For some big conferences, like in the US, whatever abstracts are submitted and accepted in the conference, they get published in the journal of that conference. In that way, that abstract would also be, a publication, but it's just like one specific kind of scenario. Is MSP same as Dean's letter? Yes, I believe it is the same as the Dean's letter. Yvonne asks, if I belong to a volunteer research group, should I list as a researcher volunteer? Now, that's like a tricky question. That's a trick question. I would say, depending on what you're doing in the research group, is it like you are organizing opportunities for research, or are you actually doing the research? If it's like more of an organizational, administrative, arranging kind of thing, coordinating stuff, it would be volunteering. But if you're actually doing research and you've worked on a lot of different projects and very heavily involved, then it would be basically under the research experience. Andrea asks, do we need to assign the MSP to each program or how it works? No, so the MSP is going to be uploaded to ERAS by your program and by your med school, and programs will automatically receive your MSPE. Stephen asks, can we apply without medical school transcript and update program coordinators later? You would have to confirm that, because I think some of the programs obviously make it clear that you need to have the transcript when you apply. So I do not have a definite answer for that, nor do I know how programs will receive that if someone doesn't have the transcript so far. But I would think it's pretty important to have the transcript when you apply. But if you're in a situation where you can't get the transcript early enough, that's fine. Apply and then update the program coordinators later. Muhammad asks, will these lectures be posted online? I believe the organizer will be better able to answer that. They're being recorded, so there might be some possibility of access to them. Yvonne asks, if I have published a paper, but it was done with a group of colleagues, not like an official research position, should I mention something in the experience section or mention only the publication? Again, I would generally like avoiding redundancy. If it's a publication already, then a publication should be sufficient, more than enough. And again, in the context of your other involvements, if you have other research experiences and stuff, you don't need to mention this as a publication. As a research experience. DS asks, can we apply to the programs that mentioned if they're osteopathic recognition? Yeah, you can. So I think it's like the other way around. It's those programs that also accept, DO graduates, but you can apply to the programs that are osteopathic recognized. Yvonne asks, what do you think about a position of pharmacovigilance analyst? Relevant enough to be included? I think that's pretty cool generally. And if this was like a work experience that, that was like a job, you should more than, mention it. You can feel free to mention it, depending on how long you worked in that position. Any editing services you could recommend if you don't have anyone we know to review it? Honestly, I would suggest, there's Fiverr, there's Upwork. I myself have been reviewing applications. I reviewed a lot for free, but I do offer services for, more thorough proofreading and editing. This is not marketing because I've just been very busy and I haven't kind of taken my pedal off of that. I haven't been doing much of that, but I think on Upwork and Fiverr, you can find some very good people. You just want to make sure, these are people who are sincere. A lot of people do this for money, but you want to make sure that they will thoroughly review your application, look at the ratings, look at the reviews, see if people are happy and satisfied with their service, if the pricing is reasonable. And, they should generally be able to do a good job. And generally, I would say like on Fiverr, if you're like getting your ERAS CV reviewed, $20-30 is what you should expect to pay, maybe lower if possible. Edward asks, some programs had few IMGs or not IMGs at all. Do you think it's because we don't apply to these programs because we think we don't have a chance? Well, yeah, that's a good point to make. And I think, again, it's just that kind of cycle. Um, there are a lot of programs that have no IMGs or very few IMGs, and then IMGs avoid applying to them, thinking they don't take IMGs, and then they will remain having no or very little IMGs. So that's something to consider. But as I said, if you, my example, I went to Mayo, Arizona. It has very few IMGs if you think about it, but I was able to do an elective here, got LORs, and so on. Had a senior in the same program, and I think that was a big factor. So we are slowly opening the door. You get me? Um, so it was my senior first, then I matched, and my classmate matched with me in the same program. And now suddenly they're like a bunch of IMGs at Mayo, Arizona. I am. So it just takes that little push, uh, that introduction, because a lot of programs just avoid IMGs altogether initially because they have no experience, they don't want to take the risk, and they can get equally good applicants locally who are US grads. So why even go through the hassle of get considering IMGs? But once they open their eyes to how much IMGs have to offer and the quality that IMGs have, I think programs become more and more comfortable with IMGs, and they're more and more willing to look at IMGs. So I hope that process continues, and to an extent that requires IMGs applying to these programs and maybe doing some rotations there, getting to know people there for them to put in a word for them so they can get an interview. So it's a vicious cycle where IMGs don't apply because there are not enough IMGs. But I think slowly that needs to be changed, and IMGs would want to venture out and explore. So don't limit yourself just because a program is not very IMG friendly. If there's a program you're very interested in, has no IMGs, don't hold yourself back from applying to the program. Malika asks, this year they have declared the SLE for IM. Is it absolutely necessary for IMGs too? I just to understand what exactly is SLE in this context. Am I missing something? Supplemental application, or is there anything else you're referring to? So if you could just clarify that, I can answer that. A asks, for the supplemental application, is there a limit to the number of geographical areas we can choose? I am not sure, honestly, because I have no access to ERAS. I don't know if there's a limit to how many you can choose. I would think there should be a limit generally to how many areas you can indicate that you have a geographical preference for. Dr. Maram asks, what about the new IMSEL? Is there something I'm missing? Something I wasn't updated on regarding the SEL. I'm honestly not sure what's being talked about, but if you could just elaborate the abbreviation, maybe I'll understand. Eunhee asks, do you think putting the workshop experiences and internet lectures, HIPAA, blood, into the CV is effective? Relevant workshops, maybe, yeah. But HIPAA and stuff like that is very basic. I don't think it would add much. For example, I had this one workshop I attended in Jordan for 3 days. It was on adolescent health, and WHO representatives were there. It was like pretty well established. So I mentioned that in like my accomplishments or something. I didn't mention that as an experience. It was like just like 1-2 lines in the accomplishments or achievements. Yvonne asks, courses and certifications should be included. If so, where? Again, I think, if these are relevant, very relevant to you, the specialty of your interest, let's say if someone has done like courses in cardiology and workshops and stuff, that's pretty nice. Or like in the specific specialty. So you can mention them in your accomplishments or involvements and so on. Yurilu, we have such a diverse group here. I'm very proud, of all the IMGs. So a lot of the names are difficult for me to pronounce. So I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing them correctly. Yurilu asks, if I have been working as a research advisor in my medical school, that experience fits into work or research. Again, I would say, what was the nature of that work? Were you actually doing the research, or were you just advising, mentoring people, and coordinating and arranging research opportunities? If that was the case, then it should be a work experience, or like if you're getting paid for it, it would be work. If it was volunteering, then it would be under volunteering. Sara asks regarding certificates, if we add certain certificates like addiction treatment, do you think we get some questions from these courses? I mean, in interviews. Um, I don't think it would be the focus of the questions you're going to be asked by your programs, but and even if the questions arise, it's probably going to be very straightforward, simple questions. Honestly, they may be like, "What did you learn from this course?" Generally, like they're not going to ask anything technical, but like, "What made you do this course?" and stuff like that. Khalid asks if you have a current unsubmitted research project that was accepted as a poster. Should you add this project under research experience or in addition to poster presentation under publications? Um, Again, I would say it depends on what your involvement was in the research project, and if you how much other research experience you have to talk about. If you don't have much, you can mention that as a research experience and elaborate on everything you were involved in, especially if you were heavily involved. Otherwise, publication should be good enough. iPhone asks if you've completed a basic lab research skills course, where does that go in your application? It would go under the accomplishments or the achievements or the other things you want to mention. There's a discussion whether it should go under the research experience. That's a soft call, honestly. Like, if someone has no other research experience, they may consider mentioning that in the research experience, and if especially it was like an elaborate, thorough course. So yeah, there's a possibility of it going under the research experience. Lekha asks, if my paper is not on PubMed but is published locally, how would I word it? And also, I would be able to would I be able to facilitate to publish it on PubMed? It was a case study. Well, because PubMed essentially, there are certain journals which are PubMed indexed, which means their publications are indexed on PubMed. If your journal isn't PubMed indexed, I'm not sure what's the way to get it indexed on PubMed. I would think there is really essentially no way, but I don't want to be pessimistic. There might be a way. You would want to look into that. But in on ERAS, it would be just like any other publication you'll mention. You'll mention the title, you'll mention the authors. It asks for a PM ID if there is one. If there isn't, that's fine. Just leave it blank, leave it empty. Bayan asks about the recording. The organizers will be able to better answer that. They'll let you guys know like where you can find the recordings for these once they email you guys after the webinar. Yvonne asks, honor roll should be mentioned in awards/accomplishments. So I think there is this section early on which says if you were part of the Alpha Omega group or like any honor society, stuff like that. If your thing fits there, you can mention it there. If not, then you can mention it in the med school accomplishments and awards. Puneet asks, can we include extracurricular awards won in medical school and med school awards instead of other awards accomplishments? I have to mention other things in other awards and there is limited space available. Yeah, you can do that. But if those extracurricular awards were in med school and you want to mention them in med school awards, feel free to do that. Sometimes we have to do that to kind of just organize things in a way where we make most of the space available, and you can definitely do that. Tasneem asks, does volunteering in conferences carry any value or worth mentioning? Good question. I would say it would depend on the nature of your volunteering. As part of a conference volunteering, there's so many different roles. You could be one of the organizers, you could be something more technical like registration, you could be doing something more basic like ushering, you could be responsible to kind of coordinate with the speakers about their times, requirements and stuff. So the things I've mentioned, ushering seems to be the least important because it doesn't require much skill to do. You get me? If it was something that about you being one of the organizers or you coordinating with the speakers and stuff like that, or coordination of the flow of the conference, and that's something good to mention. Otherwise, ushering is something I wouldn't generally mention, basically. Or if someone was like just welcoming guests in, I don't think that's good enough to be mentioned. Sal asks, can you write different personal statements for each specialty you're applying to? Yes, you can. You can put up as many versions of personal statements you want on ERAS, and then you assign them to the specific programs. Am asks, for non-medical, I was also thinking experiences and accomplishments in arts, music, sports. I guess those could go under other accomplishments. Um, yes. So I would say if you had significant, let's say you represented your state or the country in a certain sport or won national awards, definitely mention them. And they can go under other accomplishments. Yes. Bayan asks, do you know what's the difference between pathway 1 and pathway 3? Bayan, I wish I knew, but I do not. But I think you should be able to find that information on the ECFMG website. I know that pathway 1 is, I think, the one I went through this year. I don't know how they've changed the pathways this year. But pathway 1 was basically the one we had to go through, where we had to be licensed in a different country, take OET, and then eventually get certified. So I'm sorry, but you'll probably find that information on their website. DS asks, should I mention a publication that was unfortunately published in a not so legit journal website? I don't know what your definition of not so legit is. If it was a predatory journal, then maybe it's kind of risky to mention it. But if if it's like a legit journal, you can mention it. Now, at the same time, if you're short on publications, you can probably just go ahead and you can mention it, because I don't know how many programs will go and look at a predatory journals list and look and cross check this journal with that. So most likely you should be fine with mentioning it, because it counts as a publication, and rather have you have the advantage of having a publication that you absolutely just excluding it. Humra says, I have publication in surgery, but none in IM. Is it okay when I apply to IM? Yes, it is okay. It's still a publication, shows that you were interested, you were involved, scientifically, and you should mention it. DS asks, do we mention poster presentations that we were authors in, but not the presenter? Yeah, because I had a poster presentation that was accepted in a conference. I wasn't able to travel, but I still mentioned it, So yes, as long as you were one of the authors, you can mention it. Standardized letter that is supposed to replace LOR. Aha, now I understand. We had that last year as well, where we were supposed to get this letter from the DOM letter, basically, the Department of Chair letter. Now, from my experience last year, there are a few programs that specifically ask for it. They're like, one of your letters should be a DOM letter. For that reason, we had a DOM letter ready. We got one from our Department of Chair, and it was just there. And I uploaded it to the programs that asked for it, basically. Now, I don't know if all programs are asking for it this year, or is just some programs, but I would recommend, it would be nice to have. Now, what the departmental chair letter means, we got it from the chair of department, but I wonder if you could get it from your clerkship director or from the residency program director at your med school or hospital, because I have heard of people using just their clerkship director letter as the DOM letter, and they didn't have a problem. So kind of cross check that, but it would be best to get that standardized letter from someone who is in the position. Asil asks, okay, so you mentioned that. Okay, thank you. Are Coursera university courses reliable to mention in CV? So basically, if it was relevant, if it's very relevant to medicine and something that would benefit you in residency, definitely mention it. Like if it's something COVID related, if it's like statistical analysis or something like that, mention it. Thanks, DJ. I now understand what you guys were talking about, and I had that last year, and I submitted it to some of the programs, and it came in handy. Just like an additional letter. Stephen asking for a friend. She is the president of the student association. Is that volunteering? Or, well, absolutely, it is volunteering, and very valuable volunteering. I think that's important to mention. If you're getting paid for it, then it would be like a work experience. If you're not getting paid, it's volunteering experience. DJ. Okay, so that's all that. So Bayan asks, when should I start doing research? I mean, at what year of med school? That's a good question, and everyone has a different approach to that. I think usually the recommendation is, take your first year of med school easy, enjoy your time, adjust. It's a big adjustment, so take your time and enjoy. But have the vision in mind, where you want to do research. Keep an eye out for opportunities. By second year you should start getting involved in projects, and really the best way is reaching out, network with people, network with your faculty and seniors. There are always research projects happening. You just have to find them and get involved and show interest. So I started off as there were some projects that me, my friends, we initiated from scratch. There were some publications I got by me getting involved in the writing. I wrote the whole manuscript myself. So writing is an important skill. You'll realize that a lot of people need someone to write a paper. They have everything ready. They have data ready. They just need someone to write the paper. So if you're able to offer that help and get publications, that should be a very good way to get publications. And then you can just take it from there, see what your interests are in research, what kind of projects you want to get involved in, and just keep going. I think research is something that benefits you long term, very long term, for residency, for fellowship, and onwards. When you're looking for academic positions as a physician, they would want to see what publications you have. And let's say if someone did cardiology publications in med school, it will benefit them in residency and it will benefit them in fellowship. So you know research is just very important generally. So try to get research experience, publish as much as you can, while also learning from the experience. I think we shouldn't be obsessed with a number of publications, but also learn and grow through that experience. It should be a way for us to shape our interests and kind of just learn more about our personal interests, and to see what we fit best in. Well, that brings us to the end of these questions. Oh, one more question Diana has. COVID, we made a research in third year of medical school. We didn't finish it, so I was supposed to do another research. Graduate one isn't enough. I guess then I have to do more, and then at the same time I have to do the hands-on rotation. Does that much of years after graduation affect the application to step on the scores? I'm not sure if I fully understood your question. You did a research project on COVID, didn't finish it. If you need to do another research project after graduation, you have to do more years. You have to take more time. Well, I would say, that I would say getting publications maybe isn't something worth extending your gap for. Whatever research you have and whatever you can do during that period is okay, is good enough. You don't want to delay yourself and your rotations and stuff just because you're doing research. But believe me, quite often you'll be able to do research on the side while you're doing other stuff. Even right now in residency, it's difficult. It's obviously sometimes very difficult to manage, but you need to keep the research going on the side, whatever you're doing, whether electives or residency. So I would say it's not something worth extending your gap for, but focus on your electives. They will give you more value because you will get letters of recommendation out of those, and research will come along. Sal asks how to tackle a gap in CV using interview and on personal statement during interview. Usually on your CV, obviously you'll mention the gap on the CV. Now, I was mentioning this in the previous workshop, that you can choose to talk about that gap in your personal statement, or you may not need to. If you have a very compelling personal statement which has a great focus, you have a great story to tell, and everything's flowing, you don't want to disrupt that by talking about your gap in the middle out of nowhere, unless the focus of your gap year is truly the focus of your personal statement as well. Let's say someone was ill, someone had a personal emergency, family emergency, a challenge they faced, and that is truly the focus of their personal statement. Then you can talk about that gap, obviously, with your personal statement. Otherwise, if you feel it's something you need to clarify to the programs, the other option is to email programs. The other option is to talk about it in your interviews. So, just kind of assess your situation, assess how your personal statement flows, and if you truly want to mention the gap in your personal statement and how much you want to elaborate on it. Do you have enough space to talk about it very extensively? So yeah, assess your application and see where it fits best. Well, thank you so much, guys. I know this whole process can be very exhausting. It, there are a lot of times that it's difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but believe me, it's there. You just need to go around the corner and you'll see the light. Keep working hard. I hope these workshops were of benefit, and feel free to reach out to me, on the links I mentioned earlier, my YouTube, Instagram. I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. And just keep your head down, keep working hard. You guys have come very far in this journey, and there's just a few more months to go, and before you know it, you'll be matched at a great program, at the program of your dreams, and you'll be starting your residency. So thank you so much. Thanks to IO for organizing this, and I would hope to see you guys very soon on another workshop.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much,
Yep.
Dr. Omar. Thank you. Really informative. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Please make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Alfaisal MedHub for our upcoming talks. And here's the registration link for the other upcoming talks. We have one tomorrow on the ERAS application process.